So again, my name is Ian Frist. I'm a Director of Proactive Services for Blue Voyant, and I'm also a CMMC Provisional Instructor and Provisional Assessor. And after all those phenomenal discussions about deep tech topics, we're going to switch to everybody's favorite topic, which is compliance. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and handle some of the compliance piece. So CMMC, what is it? So it's a Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. They really dug deep on the naming there. So it was implemented in 2020 as a follow-on to some rules that were implemented in 2017. So in 2017, the Department of Defense realized that they wanted to get a better handle on their suppliers' cybersecurity. So they passed a rule, DFARS 252-204-7012, and they said, hey, if you are going to supply us with something, and that something has controlled unclassified information, then you have to raise your hand and say, I meet NIST 800-171. And that was it. Raise your hand, say I meet it, and on we go. Well, 2020 came around and they realized that maybe we should do a little better than just raising our hand. So they came up with the CMMC program, which implemented a third-party assessment to that piece. Also, we can go and talk about CMMC 1.x. They added a whole bunch of 20 controls. They added some other pieces and had 5 levels. I'm not going to dig into that too much because we've since rolled back to just the NIST 800-171 under CMMC 2.0. So also in 2020, they released the interim rule, which said that you not only had to meet NIST 800-171 while CMMC was taking a little while to roll out, but that you also had to upload your score to the Supplier Performance Risk Management System, or SPRS. So you had to upload your score and upload any POAMs you had for not meeting the 110 while CMMC, because it's taking a little while to get rolled out. Now they have kind of finalized the timeline. It's always been a moving target, but now they're saying that March 2023 rulemaking will be finished and we will see this in contracts in May of 2023. And again, I just want to really add in here that the biggest piece is that it adds an independent third-party assessment. So I've been talking about CUI. What is it? Well, it's controlled unclassified information. I refuse to call it CUI. Some people will. I just don't like the term, so I call it CUI. It was established by Executive Order 13556 way back in 2010. Yes, we're just now hearing about it now over the last few years, but it was established in 2010. CUI was established as an attempt, for any of you that have worked in government or work in government, you know that every agency has their own spin on unclassified information that they still want to control. Some agencies use sensitive but unclassified. DoD loves to use FOUO, DHS uses FOUO. It's just kind of, they wanted to take all that and place it under a common standard for sensitive but otherwise unclassified information. So they came up with CUI. There are 24 categories, main categories. These categories range from everything from export controlled to PII to PHI to nuclear to controlled technical information. So those are those big broad categories, and there's dozens and dozens of other categories under those. It's important to note with CUI, if you work in the defense industrial base, if your company's in the defense industrial base, you may receive that CUI from the government, but you could also create it inside your company and then send it out to the government. So if the government contracts you to make flux capacitors and they say, hey, I want a flux capacitor that does this, and you make some proprietary component, or you design a proprietary component that you're going to have another subcontractor make, you know, if that is a proprietary component that is not otherwise commercially off the shelf available, you know, that diagram becomes CUI. So you have created CUI. It's unique. You know, a lot of times in classified situations, you can't just classify information as a company, right? You have to find a classifying authority that comes down and classifies that information. That's not true with CUI. You can create it within your organization. So I want to spend a little bit of time just going over the CMMC ecosystem. So the CMMC accreditation body is the independent third body that administers the CMMC program. So DoD sets the rule along with Congress and all the fun rulemaking that we know happens in that process, right? And then CMMC, that is the independent body that they have set up to, you know, make sure it is implemented correctly. And under that organization, there's really 2 pieces, right? So we have one piece that is pre-assessment, consulting work, and then we have the assessment side. So under the pre-assessment side, we have registered provider organizations, and we also have registered practitioners that work for those RPOs. Those RPOs are organizations that have been vetted by CMMC and have applied and been listed on the marketplace and are a place you can go to get help getting ready for CMMC. You don't have to go to an RPO, but the CMMC-AB suggests that you do because they've been vetted and so on. Then we have on the assessment side, we have certified third-party assessment organizations. These are the only organizations that you can receive a CMMC certification from. Now, these organizations have gone through a much more extensive vetting process, and they've also faced a DIBCAC assessment against their own CMMC worthiness, and they've had to pass. I think currently there are 5, there may have been a 6 that just got added the other day. So it is taking some time because of the amount of DIBCAC assessors, because of the length of the DIBCAC assessments in the line to get enough C3PAOs, but they are working through it. There's several hundred waiting in the queue to become certified third-party assessment organizations. And under those, you have certified assessors, and then you have CMMC certified practitioners. Certified assessors will actually go out and perform the assessments with the CCPs. There are also licensed training providers and licensed partner publishers that provide all the training that provisional instructors right now, until we have regular instructors, can use to train assessors. I know it's a lot to keep track of, but it's all out there on the CMMC-AB's website, and I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview. So the CMMC process. So if you are a defense industrial-based company, maybe you're a big prime contractor and you make tanks, or maybe you're a small CNC shop who just makes a screw for that tank that is somehow CUI. And you know that you have to be CMMC level 2 certified because either the prime contractor has told you or the government has told you through the contract that you have to be certified. So you decide, okay, I'm gonna go get the CMMC certification done. It is your job as the organization to go to the marketplace in the CMMC-AB, reach out to a certified third-party assessment organization and schedule an assessment, right? And it's your job to pay for it too. That's a big piece of this that is different from before. So the assessment will be conducted on site, not the whole thing, but there will be an on-site portion. Thus far, the new assessment process hasn't been released under 2.0, but the assumption is that there will be an on-site portion for every CMMC assessment, and you need to plan for that on-site portion to be at every site that you plan on getting assessed. So if you're a company with multiple locations and all those locations have to be assessed, then an on-site piece follows. So it's easy to see, you can start doing some math and figure out there is going to be some cost involved with this, right? So they will come on site, they will assess your organization to meeting the 110 controls, 320 subcontrols, and you will either pass or fail. Now, you can do POAMs, very limited plan of action and milestones, for up to 180 days, but not for all controls, and they haven't released yet which controls POAMs will be allowed. There's some guesswork there, but there hasn't been a great definitive answer. So you will pass or fail on the assessment. If you fail, you will have to go back and get assessed again. They have not, this hasn't happened yet, right? There hasn't been an assessment. So nobody has said what is going to happen if you fail and you're already doing contracts. All of those questions have yet to be answered, and we hope they will be answered as the voluntary assessment period starts rolling. The scope of assessments. So this is a little more important. So what's going to be assessed when they come out? So first, there are 4 categories of in-scope assets within a CMMC assessment. There are CUI assets. These are your normal run-of-the-mill IT assets, right? That process, store, or transmit CUI. These are printers, these are regular endpoints, these are servers, things like that. There are security protection assets. So this category is anything that provides security to any of the other in-scope categories, not just providing security to CUI assets, right? So if it provides security, physical, cyber, or otherwise, to any of the in-scope categories, it is in scope for the assessment. Then we have contractor risk managed assets. Contractor risk managed assets are those assets that could process, store, or transmit CUI, but are prohibited from doing so by administrative policy, procedure, or other action, but they are not physically or logically separated from doing so. And then we have specialized assets, and this is where we're going to spend a lot of time today, because specialized assets are government-owned systems, they are testing equipment like lab equipment, and they are OT or ICS systems. It's where they fall. So that is an in-scope category. And under these categories, there are 2 columns in the scoping guide. The first is the column that you, as an organization seeking compliance, are responsible to have done before the assessment. And we'll go over those for specialized assets. And then there's the column for what you're going to be assessed against. And the gist of it is, for CUI assets and security protection assets, you're going to be assessed against all 110 controls and 320 subcontrols. For contractor risk managed assets and specialized assets, you are not going to be assessed against all controls, but there's going to be a little more responsibility on you before you get to the assessment. As far as out of scope, that only applies to assets that you can say that are physically or logically separated from the scope of the assessment and from processing, storing, or transmitting CUI. So, there we go. All right, so Ian, you stood up here and talked a lot about traditional IT assets and this compliance thing for the defense industrial base. What does that have to do with industrial control systems? Well, like I said, there is no defense industrial base without manufacturing systems, right? You're making tanks, or you're making munitions, or you're making a screw for a tank or a flux capacitor, right? These are being made by manufacturing systems, right? So these DIB companies, you know, they're use ICS across their environments. And a lot of times, unlike other sectors, it hasn't been regulated and hasn't been assessed before. These DIB companies can range in size from very small machine shops with 5 to 10 employees, all the way up to massive prime contractors that are making jet fighters. They can also be really large companies where the military part of their business is a very small piece of their business. We've seen that a lot as well. And as I said, with specialized assets, your ICS assets are absolutely 100% in scope for CMMC. I just want to state that they really are in scope. If you've heard otherwise, it's because they're talking about how it's not accessible to all 110 controls, but they are in scope for the assessment. So, talking about specialized assets, I really want to break into these because these are the ones that matter, right? So these are assets that may or may not process, store, or transmit CUI, and they fall in one of these specialized categories, to and include ICS and OT assets. Now that may or may not is really important, right? Because that means what they're saying is they don't want you to go out there and decide at what level, you know, does something become CUI. And before the scoping guide, when we were in 1.x, we were sitting there trying to decide if the information a PLC processed was CUI, right? That's a very difficult, you know, distinction to make. At what point is it aggregated enough that it becomes controlled unclassified information? You know, does a historian that's keeping track of how a process runs that has all that data, is that controlled unclassified information? You know, that's a difficult distinction to make. So in the scoping guide, what they've said is we don't care. We don't care if it process, stores, or transmits CUI. These are the things that are making what matters to the DoD, so we want them in scope for the assessment. So I talked about contractor requirements and I talked about CMMC assessment requirements. So the contractor requirements, there are 4 contractor requirements that are expected of you before the assessment starts. And they're document in the asset inventory, document in the system security plan, show that the assets are managed using your risk-based security policies, procedures, and practices. We're gonna spend a lot of time on that one. And document the network diagram of the CMMC assessment scope, right? And then you get the lighter side of the columns. You're gonna review the SSP in accordance with CAL 2.3.12.4 and do not assess against any other controls. So specialized assets are interesting, right? On all the other ones, there's 110 controls and 320 sub-controls that they are assessed against. But here, under specialized assets, you're only assessed against one control, but there is a lot of responsibility placed on you to show other things before the assessment. So what do these requirements mean? Well, let's start with asset inventory. Everybody in here has an accurate asset inventory of their ICS environment, right? Right, so you might have an accurate asset inventory. You know, some companies do, right? You've spent that money, you spent that time, and you've made that step. But we all know, especially in manufacturing, right? Especially in an environment that has never been regulated before, if you have a line that has been making hand grenades for 60 years, you probably haven't looked at it in at least 20 years, right? They turn it on in the morning, it makes hand grenades all day, and they turn it off at night. It works, it's great, and the guy who installed it retired 20 years ago, right? So that's something we see a lot in manufacturing. So now you have to have that asset inventory. You have to go to that hand grenade line that's 40 years old, that got updated sometime after the Gulf War and now has these industrial control systems, right? And you have to have that asset inventory of those systems. You know, we know right? There's a reason that a lot of people don't have that asset inventory is it costs time and it costs money, right? There are a lot of great tools out there that can help you to get really close on an asset inventory. But if you've been in ICS long enough, you know that you're going to end up with boots on the ground, walking around and touching something to see what it is, right? Because some of these systems are just that hard to figure out. Next, we have network diagrams. Well, if you don't have an asset inventory, you don't have an accurate network diagram, right? So this is another piece, another fundamental piece that you have to get through CMMC, right? So you've got to start with the asset inventory, and then you got to work on the network diagram. You need to show how all the systems are connected, and you also need to be able to show the flow of CUI through your environment. When does it come in? When does it flow down to those ICS systems, and when does it flow out of them, right? You have to have an accurate asset or an accurate network diagram to be able to do that. All right, next we have the one control to rule them all. So CUI assets and security protection assets, like I said before, are assessed against all 110 controls and 320 subcontrols. But every category, all 4 categories, are assessed against CA.L2-3.12.4, which is the system security plan. Now, what is interesting is you keep hearing me say 320 subcontrols. Well, 8 of those 320 subcontrols rely on this one control, right? They've taken a lot of time to detail what they want to see within a system security plan. A lot of those details include that you just have a system security plan, right? They start there. Then we move into things like boundaries and the environment, right? And the controls you're implementing. A couple of the key controls that I think are a little tougher for some organizations are identifying which controls will be implemented, right? And we'll cover a little more on that soon. And identifying which controls will be marked not applicable, right? So even if you don't apply all 110 controls and 320 subcontrols in your ICS environment, which controls are you marking as not applicable? Which controls are you marking as not being applied, right? That takes time to understand your environment that well. And then these SSPs are not fire and forget. You have to define how often you're going to update them, and then you have to update them that often. If an assessor comes in and you've provided evidence that says, I'm going to update my SSP every 30 days. Well, the first thing I'm going to ask is, okay, fine. Can I see your last 3 SSP updates? And you say, well, I haven't actually gotten around to that yet. Or you're not following what you defined and you're not going to pass that control, right? CMMC gives you a lot of leeway in deciding those things. CMMC lets you define that amount of time, right? CMMC lets you set those limits, but you have to follow what you've defined. All right, now my favorite control out of all the specialized assets. And that is show the assets are managed using the contractor's risk-based security policies, procedures, and practices. But wait, Ian, you said only one control was accessible. And that's true. There was only one explicit accessible control, and that is CAL2-3.12.4. But you'll notice in that contractor responsibilities column, they want to see that you're using your risk management process to decide what controls to implement. Risk management is a key tenet of CMMC, right? So they have said, that's fine. You don't have to apply all 110 controls, 320 subcontrols. You get to decide what to implement, but you need to show us how you came up to that decision, right? So that's a big difference from a lot of other, compliance and regulatory bodies out there, right? They're allowing you to make the decision, but you have to show the process you used to make that decision. All right, so that's an overview of CMMC, right? What it is, what CUI is, not CUI, right? And we've talked about specialized assets and how they're in scope. So what does this all mean for us, right? Well, it starts with understanding your data. Does this apply to me? How do you figure that out? A lot of you in the room don't work in contracting, right? You don't work in sales. You know what your company makes, I'm sure, right? And you may know, oh, hey, we do something with the government. It's some small piece of my business. Or you may know, hey, I'm a big prime contractor and this is all I do. But you have to answer that question first. Am I a member of the Defense Industrial Base? How do you figure that out? You might know that you make something, right? And you think it might go to DoD. You have to go talk to those contracting people. You have to go talk to those marketing people, whoever is handling those sales. And then once you find out if you're a member of the DID, you have to go and figure out if you have controlled unclassified information, right? So how do you do that? Well, unfortunately, the government's not marking it everywhere like they should be, right? We know that. There's a lot of FOUO. If you see FOUO floating around, then that is something that you need to look for. If you see sensitive but unclassified, something to look for. If you see export controlled, something to look for. And then you need to help dig into those contracts or have your contracting people dig in and look for key terms. Look for NIST 800-171, look for CMMC, look for DFARS clause 252, 204, 7012. I'm gonna test everybody on that at the end, right? Which DFARS clause was that? But so look for those key terms and figure out if you store, process, or transmit CUI. So to do that, you've got to identify who is the relevant person responsible for handling those contracts. Once you've done that, now you know whether or not you have to comply with CUI and you can, or CMMC, and you can move on, which is then where you have to master your environment, right? You cannot push off that network inventory project any longer, right? There were a lot of chuckles when I asked who has an accurate asset inventory, right? If you have to comply with CMMC, you've got to get that asset inventory done. We just have to, right? Step one. Step two, you got to figure out and understand your data flows within your environment. You know, it turns on, it makes hand grenades all day, and then we turn it off at the end of the day isn't good enough any longer, right? You have to challenge those engineers, you have to talk to them, figure out what systems communicate with each other, how they communicate, and what data they're sending. And then you have to figure out your risk management process. So step one here is if you don't have a risk management process, you desperately need one, right? If you have an IT risk management process, maybe you see if you can make that fit, right? Take a look at it. It's a place to start. How relevant is it to your OT environment? Start there. If you have a risk management process, have you run it in your OT environment? You know, list the current security controls that you have inside your OT environment, and then run your risk management process against them to see if you have met the level of acceptable risk you're shooting for at your company. But again, if you don't have a risk management process, after you figure out your asset inventory and after you build a network diagram, this is the next step you have to do, because this is a big hurdle to get through. All right, so here's my cringy catch line I came up with, but it really is true, right? So that's a lot to take in when it comes to CMMC, and there's a lot to do, but I really, truly believe this is going to be worth it in the long run. All right, CMMC will be good for the entire ICS ecosystem. Since when has manufacturing been regulated, right? It hasn't really happened. You know, FDA's in there in some areas and they do things like validating processes and making sure they're staying the same, but there's not been a cybersecurity regulation in most of manufacturing. You know, they say the defense industrial base is made up of 320,000 companies and at least 86,000 of them are going to need to be CMMC level 2. So this is good for that. For that network inventory project that you've been waiting on, this might help you free up funding, right? We all know that a lot of times having a compliance burden or a regulatory measure you're facing is a lever you can pull on to get some cybersecurity investment. That's a good thing, right? It's always good to have more money. Also, this pushes the organizations to take care of the basics, right? You're not gonna be able to get away with not having that asset inventory, and you're not going to be able to get away without having that network diagram, right? And you're not gonna be able to get away without having an accurate and relevant risk management process. So this is gonna force you to take care of the basics. And a lot of those basics weren't neglected out of want, right? A lot of companies have wanted to take care of these basics. A lot of cybersecurity teams have been trying to, right? It goes back to funding, you know, and other issues like that. Now you can use this as a lever if you're one of those defense industrial based companies, because it's coming, to finally take care of those basics. And I really do, this is my favorite part of the whole entire CMMC process when it comes to industrial control systems. And it's because it requires risk-based cybersecurity and not just compliance chasing, right? This isn't just 110 controls out of NIST 800-171 that don't fit ICS environments that you have to try to shove into an OT environment and check the box, right? You get to decide what level of risk your company is comfortable with, and then you get to build a risk management process to assess the risk you have, and then you get to apply security controls to get risk to the level that is tolerable for you, right? So that, I mean, that is a phenomenal option for a compliance and a regulatory body to take. You know, they didn't neglect ICS, they didn't neglect the OT. Instead, they said, hey, we're not gonna smash a bunch of ill-fitting controls or try to make you climb some huge mountain of compliance. We're gonna make you decide what controls are relevant for you, but we're gonna make you show that process. Show that you've signed off on that process, show that you've accepted that risk. And they want you to do that at a pretty senior level. One of the things that comes up in CMMC is the bifurcation. which is that some companies are going to still get to self-attest for a while and say they meet CMMC level 2. But part of that is they want senior leadership to sign off on that self-attestation. They don't want just the cybersecurity manager to sign off, right? They want their senior leadership to buy in, to have that accountability. Well, the same goes for risk management, right? They want to see that risk management process is from the top down, that you have that leadership buy-in. So some final thoughts wrapping up. CMMC is here to stay, and I think that is a good thing for our environment. Yes, it's a moving target. Yes, it has changed in the past couple of years, but the change and the motivation behind the change and the amount of money and effort that has been spent, it's here to stay. Is it going to look exactly like it looks? Maybe not, right? It might change next year. They might retool things a little bit. The good thing is the requirements as they exist right now for your industrial control systems, well, they don't hurt to implement, right? Having an asset inventory, having a network diagram, and having a risk management plan are all good things. If you implement them and they drop those requirements, you're in a better place anyway. But I don't think they're going to. I think the scoping guide as written is going to stay through this 2023 implementation, if I'm looking through my crystal ball. OT environments are 100% in scope. You can look at the scoping guide, it's written right there. They are an in-scope category. So I don't want anybody to think that your ICS is to be forgotten when you're looking at the CMMC compliance. And again, because like I said, this is my favorite piece, this is not just chasing arbitrary requirements, right? We have you get to make meaningful risk-based decisions to apply relevant security controls to your environment. And with that, thank you, and I take questions.